From Recorded Future News and PRX, this is Click Here. A few years ago, Ed Lu recorded this video from the International Space Station. He was in the station's bay, floating about 250 miles above the Earth.
Good evening and greetings from the International Space Station. I'm Expedition 7 Flight Engineer and NASA Science Officer Ed Lu.
He lived on board for 6 months in the early 2000s. Now, there are certain preconceived notions we Earthlings have about space travel. Like, it seems like it might get lonely up there, floating endlessly in the cosmos.
Lonely's the wrong word. Busy is the right word. We had so much to do. So you're always doing something. You're always, go.
And spacewalks? Well, Hollywood would have us think they're incredibly quiet. But that's wrong, too.
The worst thing would be if it was quiet, because that means your fan has died.
In your suit.
Yes. You have to blow oxygen and air over your face. There's a whirring sound to the fan. And if you stop hearing that sound, it is a bad thing.
The sound of space is a whirling fan?
That's exactly right.
During his NASA career, Ed did spacewalks. And a spacewalk isn't so much a walk as it is a workout. They usually last for hours. So people like Ed check instruments, tighten bolts, and look for problems on the station's exterior. And as he made his way around, moving from one handrail to the next, he fully expected to see some loose bolts and this spectacular view of the Earth. But there was something else he kept spotting too, something pretty terrifying. Holes. Lots and lots of holes.
I remember seeing a sort of hole in one of the handrails, looked like a bullet hole. And at that time, the space station had only been up for a few years.
These holes were created by what NASA has deemed the number one risk to astronauts in space.
NASA does something they call a probabilistic risk assessment, where they try and add up what are the largest causes of risk, and quantitatively, as best as you can. And the largest risk for astronauts on the space station is space debris.
Space debris. There are millions of pieces of it circling the Earth. There are big pieces, everything from dead satellites to spent rocket stages, and tiny ones like bolts and paint flecks. And they're all whizzing around at speeds that can be faster than a speeding bullet. It's a huge problem. Think about what a pebble does to your windshield at 80 miles an hour. And this is much, much worse.
It was that way in 2003. It's that way today. Every year, year in, year out, it's number one on the list.
This is exactly the danger that played out in the movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock.
Explorer's been hit. Explorer, do you read?
Sandra Bullock was an astronaut out on a spacewalk when the shuttle was hit by debris, and she was catapulted into the void.
Astronaut is off structure. Dr. Stone is off structure.
Could you hear debris hitting the space station?
I have heard that, a very loud ping sound. You'll hear it throughout the space station. You don't know where it's coming from.
And about 10 years ago, when Ed stopped being an astronaut, he decided to try to nail down where all those pieces of space junk were coming from. Not just to help future astronauts, but to keep people on Earth safe too. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this is Click Here, a podcast about all things cyber and intelligence. We tell true stories about the people making and breaking our digital world. And today, we look at the vexing problem of space debris. Not just what it is, but now that it's there, how our adversaries might be able to make it a whole lot more dangerous. Stay with us. From Recorded Future News, this is Click Here. I'm Dina Temple-Rustin. When Ed Lu retired from NASA in 2007, at first he was focused on what you might call a more organic form of space junk.
We've been working on the problem of preventing asteroid impacts on Earth.
Ed helped launch a nonprofit called the B612 Foundation. It's a reference from The Little Prince. It's a tiny asteroid-sized world in the book. Ed and the people at the foundation decided to map and track as many near-Earth asteroids as possible because, and this is important, if we can find them early enough, we can do something about them.
If you know where an asteroid is, years ahead of time that one's going to hit the Earth, it's almost relatively easy to deflect an asteroid. All you need to do is give them an absolutely ridiculously tiny nudge to make them miss the Earth.
Really?
This happened in real life just a couple of years ago. NASA used a small spacecraft to slam into the asteroid Dimorphos.
NASA is about to intentionally crash a spacecraft into an asteroid, and they're going to do
mission known as DART, a test of, quote, planetary defense.
3, 2, 1. Oh my gosh.
In the name of planetary defense. It is a first for humanity. NASA successfully changed the path of an asteroid.
After doing that for several years, Ed then spotted a trend that was happening so far in the background, or maybe so far up in space, most of us probably didn't give it much thought.
3, 2, 1.
SpaceX lifted off from the launch pad in Southern California. Minutes later, sending 10 satellites into space.
Thousands and thousands of satellites have been launched into space, and now they're tracking our weather, sending us TikToks, and hopefully providing directions so we can get to brunch on time. They've become kind of like the utility poles of space. No wires, but just as vital.
All of our modern day life is dependent upon things going on in space. A lot of people don't realize this.
It sounds strange to say it, but as more and more satellites go up, space is getting more and more crowded, or at least the area where satellites typically settle, something called the low Earth orbit, or LEO. It's about 1,200 miles above us.
So there's a lot of activity, and there are satellites that tail other satellites, that track other satellites, that get close to the maneuver, to get close to other satellites. There's all sorts of stuff happening. It's a very dynamic situation.
He's not exaggerating. There are about 10,000 active satellites in low Earth orbit right now. And there are something like 25,000 or so pieces of space debris that are large enough to be tracked. Things like bits of satellites, with another 250,000 pieces of untracked debris, like those paint flecks. Low Earth orbit is no longer like a backcountry road. It's getting dangerously close to the Autobahn at rush hour. As Ed watched this unfold, he had an epiphany. This cosmic highway needs a traffic cop. So he switched from tracking asteroids to tracking satellites and space junk. And he helped set up a company called Leo Labs. They've set up radars around the world to track all the stuff that's in low Earth orbit.
What we do is we help satellite operators prevent collisions with other objects because we tell them where everything is.
They can spot when debris is on a collision course with something and then alert people so they can stop that before it happens.
Flight 022, turn right at 180 and maintain at 3000.
Often well before it happens. Leo Labs can actually predict potential collisions up to 7 days in advance, so they can give companies plenty of time to move their satellites out of the way.
We've had some very close passes. We have tracked objects that have gone within a few meters of each other, a few tens of meters for sure, at a relative velocity of 15 or so kilometers per second. That's 35,000 miles per hour. And to miss by like meters is crazy. And we've observed that many times.
If all of this wasn't already making you feel anxious enough, the threat actually isn't just about one satellite hitting another, a kind of interstellar fender bender. The real concern is a pileup. Because, of course, when you move to avoid Object A, you might be running into Object B. And if you hit Object B, it might then ricochet off a half dozen other objects. It's kind of like being at a dinner party where someone bumps the table. A glass falls, shatters, and as someone lunges to catch it, they also bump the table. And another glass goes flying, and then another. Pretty soon, what was just one spilled glass is now a chain reaction mess. The concern is that a couple of errant satellites can do something similar, but in space. One piece of junk hits, say, the space station, and something flies off, and it becomes another piece of junk. And every collision increases the odds of more collisions. And eventually, the space around the Earth could get so cluttered that satellites are under constant threat of that. Or even worse, that launching new satellites becomes almost impossible. A NASA scientist named Donald Kessler worried aloud about this back in the 1970s, but he had a sort of evil twist. Not just what if two satellites accidentally run into each other, but what if some villain hacked into a defunct satellite, turned it into a projectile, and then created one of those destructive chain reactions? Not by accident, but on purpose. This is now known as the Kessler syndrome, and should it come to pass, the worst-case scenario could be terrifying.
Space is increasingly a contested environment, and it's actually a warfighting domain.
That's when we come back. Stay with us.
You come to the New Yorker Radio Hour for conversations that go deeper with people you really want to hear from, whether it's Bruce Springsteen or Questlove or Olivia Rodrigo, Liz Cheney, or the godfather of artificial intelligence, Geoffrey Hinton, or some of my extraordinarily well-informed colleagues at The New Yorker. So join us every week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
ChatGPT, AI machines,
satellite, engine ignition, click here, and liftoff.
Satellites in space have become central to maintaining stability here on Earth. They're core to military strategy, internet functionality, economic growth. So Kessler's nightmare scenario that someone might intentionally try to disrupt the satellite system isn't just a theoretical scientific concern, but a very clear and possibly present danger.
Because space is so economically important, strategically important, there is the potential for bad actors to create mayhem. You could cripple a company or a country by cutting off certain key services, right? And that's what countries and companies are worried about.
Turns out that preventing that kind of mayhem in space has a terrestrial equivalent, something near and dear to our hearts: cybersecurity.
Why is the internet a target? Because that's where the money is, right? Or that's where all the services are. The same can be said of space right now. Just like the cybersecurities are tracking what's going on the internet, we're tracking what's going on in space.
And just like cyber threats, space threats seem to be growing almost faster than we can keep up. Just ask Bob Gourley, the former chief technology officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA.
I believe we need to treat space junk as a cyber threat.
He came to this conclusion after spending years studying these threats up close.
I was an early consumer of the nation's intelligence capabilities from space.
DIA is the agency at the Defense Department that produces and manages foreign military intelligence. And Bob says it's only a matter of time before space junk is weaponized. In the same way, it was only a matter of time before computer code went to the dark side. And this threat could come about in a very unexpected way. So far, we've been talking only about all those new satellites that have been launched recently. But what about this other problem? Satellites that have been in space since the late 1950s.
We have satellites that were launched decades ago that are still up there that are not as secure.
There are untold numbers of satellites up in space right now, running on software that was developed during the Kennedy or Nixon administration. And it's so old that updating it is nearly impossible. You can see where this is headed. Those kinds of satellites could be incredibly easy to take over, much easier than you might think.
A hobbyist from their home could put an antenna up on their roof and send a wake-up command to a satellite parked in geosynchronous orbit. And next thing you know, that satellite wakes up. And then this hobbyist, in theory, could send it signals like maneuver over here, or take a picture, or send some data back. If it's some old ancient system that we launched back in the 80s, that's a definite realistic threat.
Satellites taken over by not just your weird neighbor in his basement, but a nation state with an axe to grind. They could be used as a kind of cosmic hand grenade, sent hurtling in the path of satellites that keep the internet online or military communications flowing. This isn't just an idle concern. Back in the 1990s, a time when the internet was a little clunky but still pretty magical, Bob Gourley was part of a team watching this unexpected thing happening at the Pentagon. Files just started disappearing, classified ones about military plans and NASA.
This is one where I was absolutely instrumental in figuring out who is doing it and what do they want and how do we stop them.
It turns out who was doing it was hackers from the Russian military intelligence service. And what were they taking?
The information they were stealing was about our satellites and other technical systems.
Fast forward a couple of decades, and adversaries are still doing those kinds of things. 3 years ago, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, it hacked satellites that the Ukrainian military was using to talk to its troops. And back in 2007, when Ed Lu was still at NASA, Gregory Falco says that 2 U.S. government satellites actually got hacked.
The satellites were attacked and taken control over for a matter of tens of seconds. And the operations center lost complete control over these assets.
Gregory is an assistant professor of aerospace engineering at Cornell University. And while the U.S. eventually got them back, the mere fact that someone tried to take them over for any length of time, that was a wake-up call. It sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. And it took a while to actually attribute the attack. Officials think the Chinese were behind it. In fact, they even telegraphed their plans to do it.
China had in its space strategy saying, we plan to hijack satellites. And then they've demonstrated how they were able to hijack satellites.
Though the intelligence community has been pretty tight-lipped about any satellite hacks since then, Gregory says they've happened.
There's been a number of attacks against these systems. Most of them that happen in space, though, are usually not disclosed publicly.
Whether or not people are willing to talk publicly about these celestial hacks, there is a way to spot them by looking at what all these orbiting objects look like when they're just spinning around the Earth, and then spotting anomalies. Which is why Ed Lu and others like him are making giant space junk maps, because if you know exactly what a satellite is supposed to do, it's a lot easier to notice when that changes. Ed has already seen it happen.
Then suddenly we've noticed start moving, something that just sat not doing anything for years, and suddenly start to maneuver.
I think it's really interesting that, if we look at the internet, when it was created, nobody ever thought about bad people using it, right? There was just a failure of imagination in terms of regulating it in the beginning, and we're rushing to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that we're making the same mistake when it comes to space, or do you think that we've kind of learned our lesson and we're trying to get ahead of this?
I don't think society learns its lessons like that. Any new technology has, enormous pluses and minuses, right? And nothing is entirely positive. Nothing is entirely negative. And it's a mistake to think that, suddenly, we were dumb then and now we're smart. We'll never make this mistake again, right? That's not true.
Right.
Just like everything else, something will be growing like crazy, but only a small fraction of the society realizes this and understands the significance of this great change, right? I think the majority of the population in, mid 1990s did not realize the significance of the growth of the internet. What would happen to society, same thing's happening in space right now. Enormous changes are afoot.
This is Click Here. Today is Tuesday, January 14th, and here are some of the top cyber and intelligence stories of the past week.
Hey Siri, can you talk to me?
You go first. Tell me your hopes, your dreams, your favorite cuisine.
Apple is settling a $95 million lawsuit that claims their voice-activated assistant, Siri, recorded conversations after being unintentionally turned on and then shared that information with third-party advertisers. Apple has denied any wrongdoing, but as part of the settlement, they said users can get $20 for each Siri-enabled device they own, and Apple has clarified its privacy rules. Apparently, contractors do listen to Siri's audio. But Apple denies that they sold that data to build marketing profiles on Siri's users. Apple says any audio recordings Siri captured aren't saved unless users explicitly opt in to help improve Siri. And it will keep trying to make Siri's privacy protections even stronger. Meta has said that it will stop using third-party fact-checkers on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and will rely instead on users to add notes to posts. CEO Mark Zuckerberg made the surprise announcement.
We've reached a point where it's just too many mistakes and too much censorship. The fact-checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US.
Meta's fact-checking policy was originally instituted to try to stop the spread of misinformation across its social media apps. Critics say the company is trying to reposition itself to be more in line with the Trump administration, which has been an advocate of unfettered online speech.
It's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram.
Zuckerberg conceded that there'd probably be more bad stuff on the platforms as a result of the decision. And finally, the fate of TikTok now rests in the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court.
If this were an American corporation, it'd be an entirely different thing.
Exactly, and the reason we know
that was the crux of the argument the U.S. Solicitor General made before the justices last week. They were listening to the company's appeal against a stated nationwide ban of TikTok if it doesn't find a non-Chinese buyer by January 19th. The social video app, which is owned by the Chinese firm ByteDance, is used by some 170 million Americans. The appeal has been winding its way through the courts since President Joe Biden signed a law clearing the way for a ban last year. Making TikTok go away, even if the justices decide to uphold the ban, won't be easy. The law doesn't require anyone to uninstall TikTok from their phones. It also doesn't say TikTok would have to stop its services from working in the U.S. Instead, the law will just make it harder to use TikTok over time by stopping companies that help make TikTok work. So if it isn't in the App Store or Google's Play Store, you can't get updates and new features. But analysts say TikTok's users can find a way around that too by finding the app somewhere else. Today's episode was produced by Megan Dietrich, Sean Powers, Erica Gaida, and me, Dina Temple-Reston. It was edited by Karen Duffin, fact-checked by Darren Ankrum, and contains original music by Ben Livingston, with some other music by Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, and our illustrator is Megan Goff. Martin Peralta is our sound designer and engineer. Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News. We'll be back on Friday with a new episode of Mic Drop.
Looking for more of the cybersecurity and intelligence coverage you get on Click Here? Then check out our sister publication, The Record, from Recorded Future News. You'll get breaking cyber news from reporters in New York, Washington, London, and Kiev, among others. And you'll see for yourself why it attracts hundreds of thousands of page views every month. Just go to therecord.media.